This episode of Delightfully Different is brought to you by Manscaped. Have him join the over 11 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. Use the code DIFFERENT for 20% off plus free shipping. Trust me, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. Approximately 1 million people are watching online pornography every minute. The internet and smartphones have made it easier than ever to consume porn anywhere, anytime. But it didn't used to be like that. It used to be something you could only view in a movie theater with strangers. I'm Lexi, and this is Delightfully Different. My next guest grew up in the adult film world before there were even videotapes.
Hi, my name is Gerard Damiano, and I am a big fan of Lexi and the Delightfully Different podcast.
Oh, thank you.
First and foremost. Secondly, I'm an artist and filmmaker. And notably, I'm the son of Gerard Damiano Sr., who was the writer-director of Deep Throat and many of the other films from the golden age, what's referred to now as the golden age of porn.
And your father, so I saw that you referred to him occasionally, or people do, as the king of porn and then sometimes the prince of porn.
Well, I actually started a blog a few years back to document my journey of telling his story. So in that, I refer to myself as the prince of porn, because if my father is the king of porn, then therefore, by divine right, that makes me the prince. Okay. I mean, it's kind of a joke, but there you have it.
And we're talking about pornography from the 1970s, and Deep Throat wasn't just like an underground in dirty movie theaters sort of a porno. This was a mainstream hit that people went to go see if you are not familiar with the 1970s and Deep Throat. And it seems like it's sort of the same with The Devil and in Miss Jones, which I'd never seen before, and I watched right before this interview.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that you watched that film. I hope we can talk about that a little bit. I don't believe you saw our 4K restoration of the film, which my father really was proud of, The Devil and Miss Jones. Not so much about Deep Throat. It was an early effort. He and all the young crew did, the best they could with what they had to work with. It was a goof. No one involved in the production had any idea how big this film would be. Now, today, most people have heard of it. Everybody knows Deep Throat. Have heard of Deep Throat. The Watergate informant, was named Deep Throat after the film. Okay?
Right.
So people know of that. Now, my father was, as I said, not so proud of the film itself because, again, he went on to make much better films. But he invented the term Deep Throat, and he was really proud of that he made it into the dictionary. So he would say, I made up a new word. How many people do you know that have made a word and it's in the dictionary? But now
it's not just the Watergate thing. It's the sex act that.
Yeah, it's the sexual technique, which my father didn't invent, nor did Linda Lovelace, but he gave a name to it, which I think contributed to the popularity of the film because it got people talking. And it was, it's a comedy. Today, most people don't realize that, it still gets a laugh, 50 years later. But for younger listeners or people that don't really know the history, Deep Throat was really the first adult film, we call it a, porn film, the first adult film that crossed over into the mainstream. Now, before that time, these films were, usually relegated to the basement of the Knights of Columbus Hall or something, men's clubs and like that, or the few theaters, in Times Square or in, red light districts in, major cities would show films that push the limit of what could be seen. And when Deep Throat came out, it was during a real gray area in the law because, since the early days of film, when film first was invented, when films were first projected on screen, there was no rule and regulation as to what you could and couldn't show.
There's no like PG or rated R or anything even.
No, that didn't come till much later. There was a Hays Code that was put together, by Hollywood so that they could kind of police themselves. So, the Hays Code was the earliest form of, let's say, self-censorship of cinema. And years later, that gave way to the MPAA rating system, which is where we get a G rating and PG and R and X. Now, I say X because in the 1970s and the 1960s, there was an X rating for film, which meant adults only. You couldn't, even with an adult, a minor couldn't go to see these films. But what happened is that the, adult film industry, which was born after Deep Throat, when my father was making films, there was no real adult film industry. There were underground films. There weren't even indie films. That came later and was quickly co-opted by Hollywood itself. But, if you weren't working for the studio system in the, 1960s and early 70s, you were an underground filmmaker. So in those days, the X rating was considered to be almost like box office poison, that, right. You couldn't show the film everywhere. A lot of theaters would be afraid to show a film that had an X rating. But later, after the success of Deep Throat and a lot of other films that came after, the industry embraced the X. And that's where we get triple X from. Right. You'll notice there's no double X. Okay. There's no two X's on
right,
film.
Right to it.
Okay. It was a way of now saying, well, you thought X was dirty. Now wait till you see the new triple X thing. And so that's what really forced Hollywood to rethink that. And they wanted to try to take the power away. And that's where we got to the NC-17, which is not as sexy, but virtually means the same thing. So now there are not technically X-rated movies, although if somebody puts out a movie and they put XXX on it, it's really a form of promotion rather than the self-censorship that it once was.
That is interesting. I guess I didn't realize that. Now, as a child growing up, did you understand what your father did for a living?
Very much so, but the subject matter, not so much. In other words, my father started getting involved in film when I was about 4 years old.
Okay.
My sister was 3. But we always knew that he was working on film, and he was very passionate about it. And, in the early days, they were making what's now considered exploitation or sexploitation films. And these are films that have really strong sexual content, but you really couldn't show anything. So a lot of simulated sex, there was a lot that you couldn't show, but the films were very, sexually oriented, let's say. And that all started to change right before Deep Throat. And that's why when Deep Throat came out, it was prosecuted. Within months after it was released, it was shut down, came back out on the screen the next day because the police didn't follow due process. But then again, it was busted, which resulted in a big trial. Almost 52 years ago over Christmas, there was a trial that was in the newspapers in New York every single day. And then nationally, it took the judge months to come up with his verdict. And 3 months later, he said this film is obscene and should be banned. And then, the war on pornography really began in earnest at that point.
So at this point, not only is it famous, like people are talking about it on the late night TV shows, but he's going to court. There's legal situations. Did the other kids, like in your school and like the rest of the neighbors and everything, did they all know what your father did? And did they understand, since it had become so mainstream because of the law?
Well, yes. I mean, by that point, now my father, before Deep Throat, had made 3 other films and worked on a bunch of other films as well. So, again, as kids, we knew that he was involved in film and a filmmaker. We knew we weren't allowed to see any of the films. These were for grown-ups. Okay. And someday when we were 18, we'd get to, actually see his films and
was that the first time you did actually see his films, is when you were 18?
No. No.
Thanks to Manscaped for sponsoring Delightfully Different. We got the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped, and my man loves it. He said he was really surprised by the quality. He even had me hold his old grooming tools and compare them to the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer and the Weed Whacker 2.0 Ear and Nose Hair Trimmer so I could feel the difference in weight and quality. He also loves the Ball Aftercare products. He said he's used other products in the past and they stung. He said he didn't have any issues with the Crop Preserver or the Crop Soother. The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra doesn't just stop at grooming essentials. It also comes with 2 holiday bonuses, the Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. These premium extras make sure he's always ready to jingle and mingle, whether at home or on the go. Get 20% off plus free shipping with the code DIFFERENT at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code DIFFERENT at manscaped.com. Stay on top of your grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws your way. I'm Lexi, and this is Delightfully Different. Today I'm talking with Gerard Damiano, whose father, Gerard Damiano Sr., wrote and directed Deep Throat. We're talking about the first time he ever saw his father's film.
I first saw Deep Throat when I was 15.
Okay.
But this was without my parents' knowledge or consent.
I'm sure.
It's important that I note that. And I had to, tell my dad that is that, again, even though my father was the king of porn, my sister and I had still a pretty normal childhood in that, and it's hard for people to understand this, and which is part of the inspiration for the documentary film that I've been working on, because there's a lot of stereotypes around sex and sexuality, especially on screen.
Right.
People have all kinds of ideas of what somebody who is, performs in a sex film or makes a sex film must be like. And that is really unfortunate because it does a disservice to all the people that are involved in that industry, because, when people talk about porn stars like they're talking about giraffes or something, in other words, like that one term can explain everyone, when really, from my experience, because, not only did I work alongside my dad once I was old enough, but, I was the youngest director of feature-length porn films myself, back in the 80s.
Really?
And from my own experience, every, person gets into the business for their own reasons, and they're all very different. Some are very positive, some are negative. Some people, there's Annie Sprinkle, who is a dear friend who, who acted in porn films when she was young, and then used that to catapult her into a career as an international art star. Okay, there are some people that do porn films and they end up committing suicide. Right. And there's a lot of people in between. And so it's hard to just say, oh, porn stars are this or porn stars are that, because they're actually people who have made decisions and have decided to have sex in front of a camera, or to produce or somehow be involved in that. And, again, people get into it for different reasons. And when my dad, started making these films, he wanted to be a filmmaker. Right. And making adult films was really the only way you could break into the business, unless you were, went to film school and went to Hollywood after. Right. So in New York, there was a lot of people making these exploitation, sexploitation films, which always tried to push the limits of what you could show. They were very sensational, could be very violent or very sexual. Right. And there were a lot of theaters around the 42nd Street area in New York that showed these films. And so, when my father first started working on them, it wasn't because he wanted to be a pornographer. It wasn't even a career that you could have to say, right. I'm going to be a pornographer. Pornographers then were making magazines and newspapers and printing, dirty playing cards and stuff. Right. So what really happened, and, we can move on, but I think it's important for people to understand what happened with Deep Throat, because you say, well, why was it on trial? Was it illegal or not illegal? And here's the thing that happened with Deep Throat and then many films to follow, is that, under the Constitution, we have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So that in and of itself should cover anything, films that you might make, no matter what the subject matter is. Now, certainly some of the things are not appropriate for children. So as long as you say, okay, this is for adults, people should be able to see whatever they want. But the Constitution does not cover obscenity. And what obscenity is really in the eyes of the beholder. So, in other words, if something is considered to be obscene, it's not protected and can be prosecuted. And so when Deep Throat went on trial, what was really on trial was the definition of obscenity. Now, there's some legal, language that defines what is obscenity and what is not obscenity. And it came down to, something that has socially redeeming value, okay, is protected under the Constitution. But if it's just for, appeals to the prurient interests, okay, sex for the sake of sex, okay, that's not covered. That's not protected. So really what was happening in court was to try to determine whether this film and other films to follow had any social redeeming value. And so, what made things get really crazy in America is that in some places, what was okay in New York City would have, the townsfolk out with torches and pitchforks in, Missouri or in Alabama or whatever. But interestingly enough, when Deep Throat was not only busted in New York City, but eventually found to be obscene, it was okay in Buffalo. They thought it was fine. So you could go to Buffalo and watch the movie, but in New York, you couldn't see it.
No kidding.
And there were a lot of different trials that were appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And when it got to the Supreme Court, ultimately what was decided and determined was that the definition of obscenity had to be left up to community standards. Because you couldn't write a law that equally applies to New York City and San Francisco and Key West and Provincetown, and also applies to Nebraska and Oklahoma or, Arizona or wherever. In other words, and not only, we're talking about states, it was down to the county and then even the town level. So it created a situation where, it was like having a dry county. So you couldn't buy alcohol here, but you crossed the county line and then you could buy alcohol there. Right. So what happened is there were some places that you couldn't see the film. But then you had people lining up around the block across the river or across state lines or county lines or in the next town over to see it. And so, of course, when you tell somebody that they can't do something, the first thing they want to do is do it.
Yes.
Everybody had to find out why they weren't allowed to see this film or what was the big deal and so forth. And, clearly it's not for kids. But if you're a grown up, who's to tell you what you can or cannot see or read or enjoy?
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So that's where things got a little dicey. And so my father found that very early in his career, he went from just being a filmmaker or trying to be a filmmaker to being a spokesperson for freedom of speech and against censorship, because that's what he felt was the real issue. Somebody coming in and telling you what you can or cannot see, and who gets to be that person and why. So I'm afraid to say that after 50 years, we've kind of come full circle, and that we're banning more books than ever before. I think my father would be very surprised at the state of things right now. I mean, he felt that by like 1974, 1975, that pornography, quote unquote, was irrelevant. That once you tried to stop people from seeing something, or, once you got over the hangups that this was dirty or something you should feel guilty of, it wasn't really a big deal. I mean, his real feeling about sex was that, it was only important. He would say this. He'd say, sex is like water. It's only important when you don't have any. And I can understand that. It's the people that are not sexually fulfilled or don't have enough sex in their lives that, are obsessed with it. Right. And people that have very healthy sex lives, they realize that there's a lot more to life than just the sex.
Was the character of Jack Horner in Boogie Nights based on your father?
That's an interesting and an important question. I'm glad that you asked that, because it comes up a lot. And clearly, the look of the Jack Horner character, the mannerisms were definitely based on my father, 100%. Yeah. Because it just, I've posted pictures of Burt Reynolds as Jack Horner and my father, and it's not a coincidence.
Right.
But the actual character and characterization of Jack Horner was really an amalgamation of different directors working on the West Coast at the time.
Okay.
And that's important to note because my father wasn't the kind of guy to party with the porn stars and like that. Like in the film, one big pool party, it seems,
Right.
and he was right in there in the midst of it. My dad wasn't like that. I mean, he was very professional. And I'm not just saying this, based on what he told me. I'm saying this based on interviews that I've done with a lot of the people that worked with him, is that he was very professional. And he would, put in a full day and go home. He didn't want to come mix with the talent after the.
Right.
He even cautioned me against that when I started getting involved in the industry myself. He said, you got to be careful because if you get involved with these people, especially with women, because, just
Right.
knowing me and my proclivities, he'd say, you won't be able to get the best performances out of them. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Once they had a, kind of a personal relationship with you, then they were no longer professional. You couldn't direct them as well. They wouldn't, treat you with the same respect that they would if you didn't have a physical or, intimate relationship like that,
Right.
which, proved to be sound advice. Okay.
Yeah, I imagine it probably would be good advice. This film only cost about $25,000 to make, and it grossed more than 600 million according to the internet. But your father did not see that.
And that is true. Now, I think the numbers came in under, it was about $24,000 that were spent to make the film.
Okay.
My father would be very quick to point out that most of that budget went to color, film, and processing.
Oh, okay.
That the crew, himself and all the crew were very excited to be working on a 35 millimeter color film. Now, today that doesn't mean anything, right? Everything is digital. There is no film. It's all cheap. Once you have the camera, it's free. Okay. But back then, films were still being shot in 16 millimeter. Films were still being made in black and white, especially these low budget exploitation films and so forth, because it costs so much to, not only buy the film stock, but to process it, make the negatives, all of that was very, very costly. So most of the budget went to that. And, a lot of the crew were working for next to nothing. They were working for a free trip to Florida in January.
Okay.
They got, a week or 10 days in Florida and, and that was it. And he was proud of that. The people were so involved and interested in their work on the film that they were willing to even do it for free. But he said, but Kodak didn't work like that. In other words, you wanted the film, you had to pay cash on the barrelhead is the way he would put it. So you couldn't barter for film. But what you could get was what are referred to or were as short ends. In other words, when you buy film, you buy it by like the magazine, load magazines of film. A full magazine could be 10 minutes long.
Okay.
And on big productions, they have a lot of money to buy film. So they buy all the film they need, load up all the magazines they need. But when you start using up a bit of film, they don't want to risk running out of film in the middle of a take, especially on a big budget thing. You might have explosions and big crowds or whatever it is. You don't want to risk that right in the middle of it, you run out of film.
Right.
So they would stop and always put in a fresh magazine, and they would pile up the old ones and take them back to the supply house. And so you could buy those cheap because you didn't even know how much film was on there. So a lot of these films were shot using short ends. So you could get them for cheap, but you often ran out in the middle of a take because you didn't know if there was 1,000 feet or 100 feet on the reel. So Deep Throat was made using that kind of, with that kind of handicap, as were many, many films.
Right.
And due to the fact that the film cost so little to make and then became this, mainstream phenomenon, not only in New York City, but across the country and then around the world,
Yeah.
It got banned in other countries, and then there were other, court cases and things, and everybody then had to see the film that you couldn't see. So it did make a lot of money. The Los Angeles Times contested that $600 million figure, 25 years ago, and said, well, how could that be possible? Everyone in America would have had to see the movie twice, in 1970. But there's a few factors now that, might even boost that number higher. Because first off, the film was shown, it was $5 to get in, which was unheard of back in those days. Films were like $1.50. Okay,
Right.
so $5. Also, a lot of the theaters were cash only businesses. So it was really hard to track how much films actually made, depending on
Oh,
what they
yeah.
reported and didn't report.
Right.
And and notoriously, my father had some, let's say, unscrupulous business partners in this film.
That was my next question is, was the mafia involved?
Yes, well, that all came out, later. My father, when he first, got involved, didn't realize the connections that his partners had.
Okay.
And it wasn't until, without going down a rabbit hole about Joe Colombo and, his murder. But when that happened in New York, he said that's when all the guns came out, and that's how I knew who I was dealing with.
Oh,
Because
wow.
as far as he knew, he was dealing with, upstanding, Italian businessmen, okay, that were, behind, Joe Colombo, who was claiming that, Italians have been maligned by the stereotype that, they're all in the mafia and so forth, which is not true. And it's not true. But in Joe Colombo's case, it was true because he was the capital of the Colombo crime families. Anyway, so yes, by the time my father found out who he was working with, he was in deep. And he had made a deal with them to do, this adult film, and then he was going to do a horror film together with, because that was, again, he didn't aspire to be, a pornographer or be the king of porn. He was just film by film doing what he could do, making a film for people that had a market for it and so forth. So you know, these guys had control of some theaters in 42nd Street, and they were hoping if they could triple their money, take that $24,000 and maybe make $100,000, that would have been a pretty good day. They had no idea what was going to happen. And, long story short, when it came time to get paid, they made my father an offer he couldn't refuse. And
I got it.
he said he was lucky to get out with his life and
Right.
went on to make other films, for other people. And, his biggest regret in all of that was that he could have made so many movies with the money. That's what he said.
Right.
It's not like he would have made a fortune and then retired. His passion was making film. So instead, he was always looking for backers and always got ripped off. I mean, throughout his career, it's something that plagued him until, he finally started doing work for hire, and where he made less money than he might have made if he would have had, percentage points and so forth. But at least he knew what he was going to get, and he got it. Because he said, like 5% of nothing is nothing. If I can't, prove or track down, he made deals where he got 30% of the movie or 50% of the movie. And then, someone actually came back to him and said, oh, well, the movie lost money, so you owe us money. So for all his work, he had no money coming in. And so that was very difficult for him because he really, and not intentionally, helped to create an industry. And, by the end of his career, he couldn't get real work. I mean, when I say real work, by the time the video industry exploded, which kind of put an end to this, the concept of porno chic. And maybe I should mention what that even is.
Yeah.
But in 1973, the New York Times made an article, and the journalist Ralph Blumenthal, who wrote this, interviewed my father about the phenomena of deep throat. I mean, they basically wrote an article about about what is happening. Why is everybody going to see a porn movie? And it's like this sensation. And he coined the term porno chic, which was at first this idea that porn was crossing into the mainstream and was becoming acceptable for everybody. Now, one of the most significant things about Deep Throat when it showed in 42nd Street and showed in these theaters was that people, and by people, I mean women and couples, were going to see these films, where before that, it was basically what we refer to as the raincoat crowd. Basically guys who would go into theaters either with a raincoat on or with newspaper, and people would sit there with newspapers in their laps, and you would just in the darkness hear newspapers rustling. Okay,
right.
Like that. A woman wouldn't go into a theater like that alone unless she was working the theater, if you know what I mean. So right. Not only were couples going to the movie and it became the in thing to do, but a lot of celebrities were going to the films. And in New York, famously, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was like photographed waiting online with everyone else just to watch this film. And, Frank Sinatra had his own copy of it. So it really became this larger than life thing. But then what porno chic later came to mean was this kind of merging together. In other words, after Deep Throat, my father continued to make more ambitious films. He wanted to make serious films. So his follow-up to Deep Throat was a film called The Devil and Miss Jones. Now, this was very popular, although, less known today, but it was a hugely popular film. So much so that if you look at the top grossing films of 1973, Devil and Miss Jones is up there on the list, as is Deep Throat. After a whole year, it was still made this list.
Right.
Crazy thing is, if you see, Deep Throat was on the Variety's 50 top grossing films, right up there with The Godfather. Okay. Yeah. But when you look at the number of screens that it was showing at, The Godfather was showing at like 360 some odd screens across America. And Deep Throat was showing on like 3 screens in New York City and then 7 screens across America. And the fact that it was making so much money, I mean, these theaters were showing the movie like every hour on the hour around the clock. I mean, they had New Year's Eve screening of the film where they served coffee and donuts afterwards, in the morning, okay, like that. So, it's hard for somebody to kind of put that into perspective. That there were some theaters, Pussycat theaters on the West Coast. There was a theater here in New York City that showed both Deep Throat and The Devil and Miss Jones for 10 years. Wow. So, I mean, imagine a movie theater that only showed one movie, not change it every week or 2 weeks or in a month or a long extended run, but for year after year after year, and people were still lining up to see it.
That's got Rocky Horror Picture Show vibes right there.
Yes. So when I say porno chic, the term was originally meant, to describe this phenomenon. But later, after The Devil and Miss Jones, that film was actually critically acclaimed. And so critics, and by critics, I mean, Pauline Kael and Judith Crist and Rex Reed, and these names probably mean nothing to most of your viewers today. But back then, These were the Siskel and Ebert, but actually, Roger Ebert wrote about these films.
I read it.
And, okay, there you have it. So suddenly adult content, porn films, had always been kind of relegated as to kind of lesser than, to be a different genre unto itself. But now suddenly the films that my father was making and other, talented filmmakers as well, were more and more ambitious, bigger budgets, actual films. My father would like to say, I don't make sex films. I make films with sex in them. And for him, there was a real distinction in that he was trying to make movies. And the fact that, in Hollywood, the couple would kiss and then the camera would pan away to the fireplace, and he would say, I want to make that same film, but what if the camera just stayed with the couple? Okay. And so when Devil and Miss Jones came out and the critics were raving about it, above all, the musical score is still considered to be one of the top 100 film scores of all time.
Okay.
And the performance by Georgina Spelvin, who was a real actress.
Yeah, she
So,
wasn't just a porn star.
no, she had a full career. She was a dancer. She was on, a number of major Broadway shows. She was, a triple threat, and she had a full career and didn't even, start her career in adult film until she was well into her 30s, and she was 37
Oh,
when she made The Devil and Miss Jones,
all
which,
right.
if you think about the lifespan of a porn star today, you think you're washed up unless, you're working, a fetish to see the film. Critics were just astounded at her performance because it wasn't just that she was having sex, she was remaining in character. And the sex was actually developing the character in the film and driving the plot forward. And so this idea of this integration where adult films were becoming more and more ambitious. At the same time, Hollywood was starting to, loosen up their moral code because, if anything has pushed Hollywood, in any direction, it's profit. And so when they saw that the studio system was now failing by the 1970s, and it was hard to get to people to walk away from their television sets to go to the movies. And so a lot of, the old movie palaces were closing down or, getting torn down. And those that survived, many of them were showing porn films because those were still the films that you had to actually go to a movie theater to see. So when they saw that they're making these, multi-million dollar, movies and they're losing money, yet here this movie made for $24,000, which still had people lining up to see it, they thought, well, okay, maybe we better get on the bandwagon and follow suit. So that's when we talk about porno chic now, we talk about this brief period when, there was this idea that Hollywood and porn films would merge and become one, and they would just be films. It wouldn't be porn films. It would be, all right, sometimes you get to see the whole thing and sometimes you just get to see the fireplace, but they're all movies just the same.
Right.
And then video happened and pretty much the bottom dropped out of the whole thing. Because as my dad would put it, anybody with a camcorder and a credit card is now a filmmaker. And so suddenly there was a huge market because adult films made this transition from being, cinema, okay, films that you would see on the screen that had plot and character development and so forth, and happened to have sexually explicit, themes and scenes and so forth. Now, when videotapes made their way into the bedroom, the films became like what were called marital aids back then. Like it could be a vibrator or a dildo or and now it's a VHS tape, which was, part of a couple's own thing. In other words, you didn't have to go in public, and that's really something that's hard for younger people today to understand because now, most porn is consumed under the covers on a smartphone or whatever.
Yeah.
That, 2 clicks of a button, you can see just about anything you can imagine. You could find somebody that's interested in that too and find,
100%. And it's free.
Yes.
A lot of it.
and it's free. But back in the 1970s, you had to go to a movie theater and sit there in public. And, as my sister and I have restored these old films, a number of the more significant ones, and we've been showing them theatrically as they were intended to be seen. And it's very different because it's a communal experience. In other words, they weren't, conceived of to be watched alone by yourself in a room. They were meant to be seen in a theater with other people. And that was, again, one of the novelties in 1972 when mainstream audiences were going to see Deep Throat is that, you might have to wait online outside the theater and you never knew who you might run into. Maybe it's Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, or maybe it's, your postman or your kid's teacher or something, and, like that. And so when people are seeing a film together, they react to it a bit differently. And it's not to say that orgies are breaking out in the theater or anything like that, but people were reacting to the films differently. I saw John Landis, talking about it was at a film festival in Italy where we were also presenting Deep Throat, and he was there to present the Blues Brothers. Okay, and when he presented the film, he said in to champion this idea of seeing films in the theater because after COVID, people thought before COVID, people thought, oh, film business is dead. People are just going to stream, nobody's going to go to the movie theater and like that. But I think what COVID taught us is that we really missed those like connections, like going out, going to a theater, sitting with other people. And what John Landis said is that when you see a film in a theater, the jokes are funnier. The scares are bigger because you start to, connect with this collective unconscious. When everybody starts laughing together, it's easier for you to laugh too. When you're just sitting there watching it by yourself, you're a little more disconnected from the film. And so what we found is by showing these films now in a theatrical setting, and we've been showing them around the world at, some really prestigious, theaters, institutions. Devil and Miss Jones just showed on Saturday night at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris.
Oh.
And so people in Europe are really, much more open to watching these films now and seeing, them for what they were. We're not just, a sex film, but part of an evolving culture. And so it says a lot about the audience of the time and where people's heads were at to see the films today, how they were reacted to 50 years ago and how people are looking at them now. And when we've shown The Devil and Miss Jones, people, especially the younger people, are amazed because they've never seen sex portrayed in such a way as where it was such a part of a story, especially a story that's very dark. Devil and Miss Jones is not Deep Throat. It's a very dark film. And so, it's as novel now in 2024 to go to the film and, to go to the movies and see an adult film with other people in a communal setting as it was 50 years ago in the 70s. It was brand new then and it's new again.
And now you guys started restoring these and then had them ready for the 50th anniversary of Deep Throat and then did showings in a bunch of different places. Is that how that worked?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, I have been working on a documentary film about my father.
Yeah.
But you can't really tell his story without mentioning Deep Throat. I mean, Deep Throat, it's one chapter in his story, but it's an important chapter. And so, we realized that in order to really tell his story, we would have to, not only mention Deep Throat, but we'd want to show clips of it and so forth and like that. So it kind of put us on the trail of either we were going to have to go to the people that had been distributing the film and, hat in hand and, and pay what could be a very large licensing fee to use what we felt, rightfully belonged to our father. So we spent a lot of time sorting that out. And we found that actually he did still have legal rights to the film.
Oh.
He just was afraid to challenge. And so, then the other part of the process was then finding the film. In other words, finding, elements or, what are known as preprint elements of the film, because we actually had a few copies of the film that I was able to find and buy. But these are copies that, are considered grindhouse prints that have been shown 1,000 times and we're all scratched and beat up and now faded and, and like that, broken sprocket holes and so forth. The film would catch and start to burn in the middle.
Yes.
Like that, the way going to the movies used to be. You never knew if you'd get through the whole screening without the thing catching on fire or whatever. So just short of the 50th anniversary, we felt like we needed to find the best elements of the film and do a restoration of it so that we could share it on the 50th anniversary and, kind of reintroduce it. But at the same time, people would be talking about it, which they were, where we're really not talking about a movie. We're talking more about people's attitudes about sex and sexuality and how they've changed in 50 years, because, it was a big deal in 1972. How would people perceive it today? So we felt that it would be important to preserve the film, and that is to put it back together the way that our father intended for it to be seen 50 years ago, because there have been bootleg versions and different versions people have put out, and there's a DVD version, which it's all cleaned up. And when I say cleaned up, I don't mean they cut the sex out. I mean, it's been digitally remastered to take all the film grain out. So it looks like a new digital film, and the colors are really bright and it's really sharp. And when I saw that, I thought, I don't remember it looking like that. When I saw it in the theater, I don't remember it looking like that. And so we were able to find a print of the film, internegative, at the Eye Museum in Amsterdam.
Oh,
We searched the world, we put out a call, and we found very quickly that the global community of film archivists and preservationists is very small. Everybody knows each other, and they feel very passionate about preserving film, because when you talk about preserving film, you're not talking just about the idea of the film, or you're talking about the actual film itself, because film is like a food product. It's, maybe the gelatin and so forth. So it starts to decompose, and rather rapidly if it's not kept right. I mean, we always had film in our refrigerator when I was a kid. We thought everybody did, we didn't realize. Okay. But now even the film prints and the negatives have to be kept at a certain temperature. The humidity is very important. The relative humidity has to be kept at a certain level. You have to be passionate or crazy or both in order to do that. So we started collecting up the films, but we were able to find this print in Amsterdam, which they loaned us so that we could base our restoration on that. And we completed it just before the 50th anniversary. I mean, working right up until just the day before, putting final credits on it and everything. And then we're able to show it in New York City on that anniversary day, and then take it on a tour around the world. And
wow.
So we showed it in a number of cities in Italy and Germany. We showed it in Canada, in Holland, in Brussels, and so forth, and in a number of places in the United States. And again, we're always surprised at the audience reaction, because people, again, everybody's heard of it, nobody really knows anymore or hadn't seen it. We always ask the question, how many people have seen this film, before we present it? And, and one time only one person in the whole audience raised their hand. And so
really?
People were not really, didn't know what to expect. And so we've enjoyed, not only showing the films in this theatrical setting, but we've always done talkbacks after the film. We're not only my sister and I, but we'll invite everyone from film critics and academics to porn stars and people who've worked together with our father to, intimacy coordinators, come on stage with us and talk about how things have changed, how sex scenes are filmed nowadays compared to how it was in 1972 and so forth. So we're always, open to questions from the audience, because again, the Deep Throat touched on a lot of different things. I mean, it wasn't just about sex and sexuality or the film itself. It then became this issue of obscenity, and what is that? What could be shown or what couldn't? It changed the way films were made. It changed the way Hollywood was making films. A number of people were prosecuted, my father included, for their participation in the film.
And the leading actor, the fella, got arrested, didn't he?
Yeah, Harry Reams, was basically scapegoated. They were trying to find ways to discourage the production of the film. So he was prosecuted. My father and Linda Lovelace were given immunity. And my father would say, you're not given immunity. It wasn't like I chose to do that. It's like either I was going to go to jail myself or I had to appear in court and, on behalf of the prosecution. But my father used every opportunity to defend his dear friend, Harry Reams, who was our Uncle Herbie. As a kid growing up, we knew him as Uncle Herbie, and he was a lot of fun. He was a great guy. He was interested in filmmaking as well. And, again, kind of got into the Deep Throat role by mistake. I mean, he was production manager on the film.
Oh, Really?
So he was actually working in that respect and had worked on other films together with my father and a small group of, underground filmmakers in New York at the time. And so he only, got that role because the actor who they thought was lined up in Miami, Florida to play it, never appeared. So there they were with Linda and the rest of the crew and so forth. So he jumped in there, and my father always said, and thank God for that, because he couldn't imagine anyone doing a better performance than Herb Stryker, known as Harry Reams, did in that film.
That is interesting. I had no idea. And so you traveled around and you presented the film. How did the audience react? Was there a lot of laughter or shock, or how did people seem to react when you started showing the restoration?
Well, the response was overwhelmingly positive. I mean, we had some really interesting and thought-provoking, talks afterwards and so forth. The only place that we had trouble was in Canada.
Really?
And that was a surprise because I always thought of Canada. I had never been to Canada before, even, growing up in New York, never been to Canada. And, we always look at Canadians as our kinder and gentler cousins to the north that don't all have guns. That's kind of how I thought about it.
Depends on where in Canada.
Yeah, well, we were in Vancouver, British Columbia, and we literally had death threats. I mean, someone had threatened to cut all our heads off and burn the theater down with us inside of it.
Really?
Which is something that the Canadian version of the FBI had to take seriously. And so, we were met when we got to the theater the day before. We arrived in Canada and our Airbnb wasn't ready. So we literally went with our suitcases right to the theater.
Okay.
And we were met by the manager and the owner of the theater, who said, we got to talk, and so they told us this story about how they were being harassed online, on social media. They were getting these threatening emails by a group of anti-porn feminists that were, located not only in Canada, but they had people all over the world, especially in Australia, that for some reason there were all these, they were getting messages from Australia, threatening them and so forth. And so we all ended up on TV that very night to just talk about it. And, the theater was really great because, I didn't know whether they wanted to go forward with the screening or not, especially if there was, some kind of actual danger to the people at the theater or people that work there.
Yeah.
But the theater owner was on television that night with us. And what she said was, this is a theater that's been part of this community for many years and really specialized in showing, different films, genre films that didn't normally get mainstream, distribution. And they said that our job is not to censor what people see and don't see. Our job is to give people the opportunity to see the films and make up their own minds. So she was actually proud to be in the position to show up film that people might not otherwise be able to see and, again, make up their own opinion about the film. And so, they hired extra security, and there was a, protest of about 40 people with signs outside the theater and so forth. But, the show must go on. And it did. And it made for a very interesting and exciting night for those who chose to literally cross the picket line to go to see the movie. And, I felt like we were back in 1970s again because, this is the same kind of, issues that my father had to deal with when he was making his films.
I'm totally surprised about that. And I know we've got less than 10 minutes left. And I know you wanted to mention some of the other films that your father had made that didn't necessarily get the attention that Deep Throat did. And there was one in particular you wanted to talk about.
Well, first off, The Devil in Miss Jones, which we have recently done a complete 4K restoration.
Okay.
And that's a film that our father was much more proud of and would, I'm sure, he's of course not with us. He passed away in 2008, but sometimes I can hear his voice. I mean, I really hear him, that he would much rather us going around the world showing Devil and Miss Jones. And so we've started to do that We screened it at Il Cinema Ritrovato Festival this past summer, which is in Bologna. It's a fabulous film festival. I don't know if any of your listeners have a chance to travel the world to watch films, but it happens every summer. It's about 9 or 10 days long, and you see not only some of the great films of the world, but the great films of history that are restored and then shown. So, in 2022, we showed Deep Throat there. And then this past summer, we showed The Devil and Miss Jones. We sold out both shows. And I know my father would be very proud to know that his film was being shown alongside Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and even Godzilla was celebrating its 75th anniversary. They showed the original Godzilla and a lot of really great films. And so just to be included in that company, meant a lot to us. And I know our father would be very proud of that. The Devil and Miss Jones will be shown on the 18th of December in Rome at Cinema Troisi. So if any of your listeners are actually in Italy, you should definitely come and check it out. The theater is great. The young people who run it have done an amazing job, and that's a story in itself. It was, they occupied a theater that was going to be torn down, and long story short, are now, running probably what is the best, one of the best screens certainly that we've ever shown the film in. 100-foot Dolby surround system. Really an amazing situation. So we're glad that film is getting some attention. But we're working on a film called The Story of Joanna.
Yes.
This is a film that our father made that he felt was his best film.
Okay.
Like the peak, it was made in 1975 during, the peak of porno chic. And, he had fabulous locations. Everyone who would work together with him on Deep Throat and Devil and Miss Jones was honing their craft. And the cinematographer who went on to have a full career in Hollywood, João Fernandes, really was hitting his stride. And they made this beautiful picture that was, very popular at the time, but then since, 1975 had been bootlegged and put out on DVD, where the people who put it together transferred the reels out of sequence. So in other words, what that means is that generally in the old days, when film was on 35 millimeter reels, a full length feature film would be, 4 reels or 5 reels or more, big cans, heavy cans of film. So they transferred these 4 reels, but when they put them together, instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, they did the first reel and then the third reel and then the second reel and then the fourth reel. So if you watch that DVD or, any other version of the film that was made in that way, it doesn't make any sense. And, so people say, oh, I saw that movie. I didn't understand it at all because, of course, you're like, well, wait a minute, why are they talking about that? That already happened. Or, you know what I mean?
Wow. Okay.
So for us, it's really kind of the culmination of doing this film restoration is doing our father's best film. And also we're putting together a complete retrospective where we'll show, 7 or 8 of his films at different theaters. And we want to take that on tour. And, of course, then have it available Blu-ray disc, on demand, streaming, etc., to open it up to much larger audience. But first we're doing the theatrical thing the way it was originally intended to be seen, and then it'll be available to larger audience.
Gotcha. And then you're also working on obviously this documentary, and you've already filmed a bunch of stuff for the documentary. When do you think that will come out?
Well, the documentary is something that, I was very much involved in until we came to that place of talking about Deep Throat. And then, I kind of had to put it on pause so that we could my sister and I do what we're doing right now, because we want the documentary film to have a happy ending. And that's where we win all the rights back. Yes, very much so. So, we had to set about in real life doing, what we want to see in the film. And that is where, the films are preserved and restored and then shared with a new audience, the end.
Gotcha. I love it. Well, we've only got about 2 minutes left, so I've got to stop. I do want to mention that you are an artist. You are, and you've got a website, Gerardist. and you've got a bunch of really cool art on there and you sell some. You also are a DJ Slinky. You're also an instructor and you're teaching Apple stuff.
Yes, well, a lot of that stuff just happens, just by being an entrepreneur, I would say. I'm not teaching the Apple stuff so much anymore, but in 2010, when the iPhone was brand new and suddenly there was this new technology that, some people, especially older people, were struggling to learn, and there wasn't really an overview. You couldn't take a class in it. So I realized, well, maybe I'll make a class, and it got really popular really quick. So I ended up, teaching 25 different classes, which I created to help kind of bridge that gap.
That's awesome. So I'm going to put links to all of this wherever you are listening to the podcast. But I think I would like to end it on, I feel like you and your sister, who I didn't even get a chance to talk to you about very much, had a great childhood. And it seems like you're really proud of your father. Is that true?
Very much so. We loved our dad. We lived together with him towards the end of his life. We bought a house together in Fort Myers. I think he actually came out to a number of the bouts. He would actually come to everyone. So yes, we loved our dad, and we feel like that the best way to honor him is to preserve these films, because to see the films, he puts so much of himself in them that you can see him in it. You can feel him in it. You feel like you really get to know him by watching his films.
Thanks for joining me on Delightfully Different. Check out Gerard and find out where to see his father's films by following him on social media. There are links wherever you got this podcast. If you or someone you know lives life differently, I'd love an interview. Email me, lexiontheradio@gmail.com. That's LEXI ontheradio@gmail.com, or go to delightfullydifferentpodcast.com and have a delightful week.